Ah yes, it's that magical time again where I talk about some obscure aircraft from the later interwar years that somehow made its way into World War II. Today's victim is the Vultee P-66 Vanguard, a fighter developed in the United States, and perhaps one of the most obscure and least talked about aircraft of its class. In 1941, several aircraft were beginning to enter service with the US Navy and Army Air Force. The Bell P-39, Consolidated B-24, later models of the Grumman F-4F, and the Lockheed P-38, just to name a few. Most of these aircraft are household names in aviation circles today, be it from singular events or feats of heroism, or by being built in such mind-boggling numbers that they simply steamrolled the opposition by sheer dint of mass. But many of you probably haven't heard much about the Vultee P-66 Vanguard, if even heard about it at all, and there is good reason for this. Developed by the Americans, ordered by the Swedes, and eventually flown by the Chinese, the Vanguard had a brief and unfortunate career. Though designed as a fighter, it spent its limited time with the US Army as a training aircraft, and then when it did see combat service overseas, it was thrown into battle against far superior opponents. To put it bluntly, it was cursed by being average, and only just average at that, and worse than that, it had arrived to the party late. Had the Vanguard been available even a year or two earlier, it might have found some relevance in the early stages of World War II, but it didn't. Now, its origins can be traced back to just 1938, no earlier than that. Now, by this point, any aircraft company which shared at least two brain cells between its managing directors could see the writing on the wall. War was coming to Europe, and regardless as to whether the United States would get dragged in, there was going to be a massive surge in demand for military aircraft, both domestically and overseas. Among these aviation firms was Vultee, a relatively new name in the US aircraft industry. At the time, it was not yet even an independent company, but was known as the Vultee division of Avco, and thus far it had experienced mixed fortunes. Its first aircraft, a commercial design called the V-1, had only enjoyed limited success owing to a switch in preference towards multi-engine transports for things such as redundancy and safety. It was then redesigned into the Vultee V-11, the company's first military design. This was an attack aircraft that gained only lukewarm interest at home, but significantly more overseas, and this channel already has a video that covers it. However, then, in 1938, in January, the company's founder, Gerard Vultee, was killed when his aircraft got caught in a snowstorm and crashed in Arizona. In the aftermath of this gloomy event, Vultee's chief engineer, Richard Palmer, knew that the only surefire way to ensure the company's survival was to secure military contracts. And with this in mind, his design team went to work on a whole series of design studies. This resulted in 4 aircraft projects. There was the Model 48 Pursuit Fighter, the Model 51 Basic Combat Aircraft, which was basically a multi-purpose attacker, the Model 54 Advanced Trainer, and the Model 54A Basic Trainer. To speed up the design process, and to increase the potential efficiency of future production lines, these 4 aircraft models shared a basic structural design. However, despite some claims to the contrary, the production aircraft that eventually resulted from these concepts shared little in the way of common parts. The Model 48 fighter was given design priority first, partly due to the growing need for combat aircraft being expressed by both US and foreign governments, especially with the German Luftwaffe showing off its shiny new Bf-109A in the Spanish Civil War, and partly because it was the most complex. If Vultee could get the fighter done right, developing the attack and training aircraft would be made considerably easier. Now, as it turned out, this was a very smart move, as although the fighter would encounter all sorts of development hiccups, spoiler alert, many of the lessons learned would be directly applied to the development of the Vultee BT-13 and BT-15, better known as the Vultee Valiant, which was the company's most successful design in its existence. The Model 48 fighter prototype was completed and ready for test flights by the start of September 1939, and at first glance it looked like a very modern, striking, and aggressive design. It was all metal, built with a steel tube semi-monocoque fuselage. It had a fully enclosed cockpit, retractable landing gear, it had a two-spar wing, which it shared with the design of the training models, and it was to feature a powerful armament of 4 or 6 machine guns depending on customer preference. The standout feature, of course, was the pointed nose, which was unusual in an aircraft which was designed around a radial engine. Different engines had been considered, but the Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp eventually won out due to its compact size. This twin-row 14-cylinder radial offered a comfortable 1200 horsepower in a relatively small package. But even so, radials were bulky, drag-inducing lumps of metal, the price one paid for having an air-cooled power plant, and Pratt & Whitney had begun design studies to address this problem of drag. In his initial drawings for the Model 48, Richard Palmer had designed a more conventional nose around a normal cowling, but Pratt & Whitney had convinced him to trial a new streamlined cowling on the Model 48 prototype. This required the engine to be modified with an extended shaft, as the prop and spinner were placed further forward, but the loss in power due to weight and mechanical resistance was expected to be made up by a larger reduction in drag. In this modified form, the prototype was completed and redesignated as the Model 61, receiving the company name of Vanguard. When it first flew on September 8, 1939, piloted by Vance Breese, the Vanguard prototype was one of the best-looking fighter aircraft in the world. I mean, just look at it. It was silver and curves from nose to tail, definitely poster material. But unfortunately, striking looks does not a good fighter aircraft make, and the prototype encountered problems from the outset. Most of these problems came from the elegant nose. The small air intake and cowl flaps provided inadequate cooling, and the engine frequently overheated, especially on the ground following test flights. Breese reported that the aircraft itself handled really well and showed remarkable nimbleness, but this was moot if the power plant was going to cook itself to death in just 20 minutes. Over several months, various attempts were then made to solve this problem. The air intake was modified several times, increasing in size and complexity. Different cowl flaps were trialled, and eventually a new oil cooler was installed separately in the bottom of the fuselage just behind the wing. The results of these modifications really did speak for themselves. Whereas before the prototype's engine overheated all of the time, it now only overheated most of the time. Yeah, the modifications were more or less useless, and they spoiled the aircraft's looks, and they wasted precious time, and, as it turned out, there was basically no performance gain from the streamlined profile at all. It was clear that the streamlined nose would have to go, and when the prototype was damaged in a landing collision with a Lockheed Sirius in May of 1940, Richard Palmer and his team took the opportunity to do so. The prototype's front end was rebuilt with a conventional cowl, the landing gear was slightly redesigned, as was the tail, and the outer wings were given 2 degrees of dihedral. In this new form, it was then redesignated as the Model 48X, and it was flying again in the late summer of 1940. Unfortunately for Vultee, the decision to test a streamlined design had cost them a critical amount of time. By this point, aircraft with much more powerful engines were now in development, some exceeding 2,000 horsepower, and the US Army and Navy were showing little interest in acquiring the Model 48 for their inventory. However, and fortunately for Vultee, with the war in Europe rapidly escalating, the company then received a production request from Sweden. The Swedish were in the process of developing their own domestic military aircraft, but it would still be some years before they would be capable of matching their southern neighbours. In the meantime, the Swedish Air Force needed to expand if the country were to maintain its neutrality, and this was done with the acquisition of foreign aircraft. An order was placed for 144 Vultee Vanguards, which would then receive the designation of Model 48C. A prototype of the 48C flew for the first time in September of 1940, and this was quickly followed by a pre-production testing aircraft in November. The only major difference between these two and the subsequent production models was the canopy, which was slightly shortened on the latter. Production aircraft were powered by the -33 variant of the Twin Wasp, which still produced 1200 horsepower and drove a 3-blade Hamilton standard propeller. Armament comprised of 6 machine guns, 4 30-caliber guns in the wing, and a pair of 50 calibers in the nose. In performance tests, the pre-production aircraft achieved speeds in excess of 342 miles an hour at 15,000 feet, and it was reported to have remarkably responsive controls, though rudder response was criticized at slower speeds. Further evaluations were then planned prior to the delivery of the aircraft to the Swedish Air Force, but Vanguard production had barely gotten underway before the US government then placed an embargo on the export of all military aircraft to Europe. 3 months later, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, all Vultee Vanguards immediately became the property of the US Army Air Corps, then to become the US Army Air Force. The Army took over the Swedish order for the Vanguard, and by April of 1942, all 144 examples had been delivered. Designated as the P-66 Vanguard, it was evaluated as a pursuit fighter but was found to be inferior to the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, though it did have better high-altitude performance. More importantly, other aircraft were about to enter service which would significantly outmatch it, and in light of this, the Vanguard was instead used by the Army as an advanced trainer. Approximately 50 were used in this role, but they did not do so for particularly long. Though easy to control and in general mechanically reliable, the Vanguard was a little finicky on the ground and more than a bit flimsy. In dives, it would often begin to shake uncontrollably at high speeds, and following intense aerobatic maneuvers, several airframes were found to have suffered structural deformations. It also proved to be difficult to handle on the ground. Over a dozen Vanguards were lost to ground looping accidents in just a few months, and, not wishing to have aircraft that disassembled themselves whenever the pilots got a little bit on the frisky side, the US Army decided it was best to get rid of them, and they did this by offering them to the British. Now, Britain was still pretty desperate for aircraft by 1942, but they weren't that desperate, and following evaluations of the Vanguard in Canada, where it impressed nobody, they decided to sell them on to the Chinese. Now, I must point out at this point that sources do conflict on the timing of these events and the decision-making process behind them, which is why I'm keeping this segment of the video very brief. Some sources claim that 100 Vanguards had been earmarked for Britain as early as October 1941. Others claim just a handful. Others claim completely different dates. It's all a bit nebulous, honestly. But it is at least known that, for a time, the Vanguard was in US service as an advanced trainer, evaluated by the British, and then ultimately sold on to the Chinese. In total, 104 Vanguards were meant to be shipped over to China under the new Lend-Lease agreement. They were intended to equip the American Volunteer Group, but the logistical operations of getting these aircraft into China were a complete shambles. They were transported by sea from the US and Canada to the port of Karachi in British India, now Pakistan today, and upon arrival, many of them had suffered from damage during transport. Whether this was due to inadequate stowage, poor weather, or a combination of both, it's not known. But in any event, bent propellers, crushed pneumatics, and broken canopies aren't exactly the building blocks for a functioning airframe. Having assembled the Vanguards, much like mutilated pieces of IKEA furniture, some of them were still found to be airworthy. Others were better off as spare parts. A few more then became not airworthy, as they were lost in accidents during test flights. Apparently, ground looping your aircraft into another wasn't standard practice, but tell that to the blokes in Karachi. In the end, only approximately 30 of the 104 Vanguards were deemed acceptable for service, and these were then prepped for a ferry flight into China. Unfortunately, the total dominance of Japanese air power meant that this ferry flight had to take place at night, and this, coupled with pilots who were totally inexperienced with the Vanguard, led to even more losses. Depending on what sources you go by, less than 15 of these Vanguards eventually made it into China from this flight, and the rest were either lost in mid-air collisions in total darkness, or were written off in landing accidents on the way in. The Vanguards that did make it were based out of Kunming, and initially operated by the 74th Fighter Squadron of the 23rd Fighter Group. In 1943, the number of Vanguards in Chinese service appears to have increased, with 15 operated by the 3rd Pursuit Group and 16 with the 11th Pursuit Group. Unfortunately, not a great deal is known about its service in this theatre, as records are sparse, but from the fragments of information that can be found, it seems that the type didn't perform particularly well. A large number were destroyed on the ground in strafing attacks, so their performance is of course excluded, but although several Vanguards managed to see direct air-to-air combat, no confirmed victories have been recorded. There is a potential victory from the 21st of November 1943, above Enshi Airfield in Hubei, but the kill was either made by a P-66 Vanguard or a P-43 Lancer, and it's still disputed. In general, its performance was lackluster at best. Although it had a decent top speed, the Vanguard could not match the maneuverability of Japanese fighters, and worst of all, it shared a similar profile when viewed from certain angles, which led to several tragic friendly fire incidents. By the end of 1943, most had been replaced by the Curtiss P-40, and the surviving aircraft were placed into deep storage, which involved covering them in tarpaulins and sticking them in the back of a dank cave, or sometimes even just placing them in ditches. It was supposedly intended to keep these aircraft in reserve for the inevitable resumption of the Chinese Civil War, but it's unlikely that any of these Vanguards would have even been in a serviceable condition by the time this happened. Regardless, some Vanguards are reported to have survived in storage, perhaps covered in vast quantities of moss, until the late 1940s, but after this, all record of them does disappear. For Vultee, the weak performance of the Vanguard had been a disappointment, and it cost the company millions of dollars. With the exception of the abortive and experimental XP-54, which I've also covered on this channel, the Vanguard would be the only fighter aircraft the company would produce. In other areas, though, Vultee would have more success. It would produce the V-72 Vengeance, a dive bomber which saw extensive service with Commonwealth forces, and it would also produce the Vultee Valiant Trainer. This aircraft, which was derived from the project that spawned the Vanguard, would become hugely successful, and eventually over 11,000 of these machines would be built during the war. But Vultee itself would not survive the war. In 1943, the company merged with Consolidated Aircraft, creating the Consolidated Vultee Aircraft Corporation, more commonly known as Convair. And Convair would produce some truly stunning designs in the early decades of the Cold War. But that's a story for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the Patreon supporters, some of whom voted on the topic of today's video. Now, I know, I did say we were returning to a regular video schedule, and I am trying, but once again, things, work, life, and shitty Australian internet got in the way. I've been having a lot of problems with internet in this new house, so I do very much appreciate everyone's patience. I'm actually going a bit mad here at the moment, and your patience will be rewarded with some longer videos in the not-too-distant future. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters. A couple of development videos are in the works, one of which you voted on, so stay tuned for that. And I've almost got the office set up for some sort of live streaming shenanigans, so hopefully that is something we will see soon, provided there is no more Australian internet-related drama. But until then, and praying that the internet gods support me, thank you all so much for your continued patience and support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.